The military helicopter hadn't even cut its engines when the blood started hitting the rooftop. Concrete thick, arterial, wrong. Admiral James Caldwell, 3-star commander of the Navy's most classified Special Operations Unit, was dying on a gurney while 12 trained medical professionals stood over him, arguing about protocol. His neck wound was catastrophic. His pressure was gone. And every single doctor in that trauma room was about to kill him with their own hands. The one person who saw exactly what was happening, the one person who knew, was the deaf nurse standing in the corner that nobody ever looked at twice. Then the Admiral opened his eyes, found her face in the chaos, and raised his blood-soaked hand in a military salute. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this live. Stories about the people who get overlooked, written off, pushed aside, and then proven devastatingly, irreversibly right. Give this video a thumbs up if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens in the next 2 hours inside Hargrove General Hospital will change everything you think you know about strength, silence, and the people nobody sees coming. The morning started the same way it always did. Nora Voss clocked in at 6:52, 8 minutes before her shift technically began, because she had learned a long time ago that being early was one of the few things nobody could argue with. She changed into her scrubs in the locker room alone, tucked her dark hair into a band at the back of her neck, and checked the charge on her hearing aids with 2 fingers pressed behind her right ear. One of them had been cutting in and out for 3 days. She'd submitted a replacement request through the hospital's accommodations form. Nobody had responded. She didn't follow up. She had learned not to push on things like that either. Hargrove General Medical Center sat at the edge of Sacramento's Eastern District, a sprawling, underfunded public hospital that handled more trauma volume than its staffing could reasonably support. The building was old in the way that institutional buildings get old, functional, but worn. The kind of place where the overhead lights buzzed at a frequency that made the night shift feel longer than it was. The ER was on the ground floor, backed by a level 2 trauma bay that the hospital's administration had been promising to upgrade for 4 years. The promise had not materialized. Nora worked the medical surgical floor, which was 3 levels above the trauma bay, and in the hospital's invisible social architecture, somewhere near the bottom of everything that mattered. Surgeons didn't come up to med-surg unless they had to. Ear physicians treated it like a dumping ground. The nurses there were considered workhorses, not clinicians, people who changed dressings and charted vitals and managed the slow, unglamorous work of keeping patients alive through the night. Nora didn't mind the work. She minded almost nothing about the actual nursing, which she was good at in the way that certain people are quietly, unfussily excellent at things they've spent years learning. What she minded was what happened in the spaces around the work. She was gathering morning medications from the dispensary when the first one started, and she missed the IV again on the patient in 412. The voice belonged to Diane Pryor, the charge nurse, and it carried the particular flatness of someone narrating something they considered factually settled. She was talking to a floor nurse named Becca near the nursing station, close enough that they were clearly not concerned about being overheard. Third time this week, patient had to call a second nurse. Nora didn't turn around. She kept pulling medication cups from the dispensary drawer. Her hearing thing, Becca said, has to be. She can't hear when a patient is reacting. She's in there alone, and something goes wrong. Diane made a sound that communicated everything she wasn't finishing the sentence to say. Nora placed the last cup in the medication tray, logged out of the dispensary terminal, and walked toward room 408. She had, in fact, missed that IV insertion. The patient's vein had rolled, which happened with elderly patients with fragile vasculature. and she had called for a second attempt from Becca rather than dig around in the vein, trying to find it, which was exactly what the standard of care recommended in those situations. The missed insertion had nothing to do with her hearing. But she had also learned that correcting that kind of story, in that kind of setting, produced nothing useful. She gave the 408 patient her medications, checked her pressure, repositioned her left leg, which had been edging off the pillow support, and spent 4 minutes adjusting the drainage tube from her abdominal wound because the overnight nurse had taped it at an angle that was going to cause backflow problems by afternoon. None of that was in the chart note the overnight nurse had left. Nora added an addendum and moved on. By 8:30, she had worked through half her patient load and was in the middle of a wound care procedure on a post-surgical patient in 419 when Dr. Marcus Finch appeared in the doorway. Finch was the ER attending who had been rotating through trauma coverage this week, mid-40s. Aggressively confident, the kind of physician who had been told he was exceptional so many times that he'd stopped checking the claim against evidence. He had that particular brand of contempt for nurses that disguised itself as efficiency. He didn't dismiss people openly. He just acted as though they weren't quite real enough to require acknowledgement. He looked at Nora. He looked at the patient. He looked at the chart tablet on the wall mount. This patient's drainage output from last night isn't charted. Nora finished the section of wound irrigation. She was in the middle of before she responded, because stopping mid-procedure to answer an interruption was not something she was willing to do. She said, without turning her head, I added the addendum at 7:41. Output was noted in the overnight handoff, but not entered in the system. There now. Finch picked up the tablet. He scrolled. He put it down without saying anything, which was as close as he ever came to acknowledging he'd been wrong. Then he said, you should make sure you're not missing things because of your. He gestured vaguely at the side of her head. Nora looked at him directly. Because of my what, doctor? Finch? He seemed to decide the conversation wasn't worth finishing. He left. Nora turned back to the wound. The patient, an older man named Robert, who had been in the hospital for 9 days, following a bowel resection, had been watching the exchange with the particular alertness of someone who had spent enough time in hospital beds to understand the social dynamics of the people taking care of him. He does that a lot? Robert asked. Often enough, Nora said. That's a hell of a thing. It is, she agreed, and finished the wound care. She documented everything, the way she always did, completely, precisely, with timestamps and clinical rationale, because she had understood for some time that her documentation was the only version of her work that would outlast someone else's opinion of her. The physician who made Nora's professional life the most difficult was not Finch, though Finch was consistent in his dismissiveness. The physician who created the real problem was Dr. Victor Slade. Slade was the director of emergency medicine at Hargrove General, a position that gave him authority over trauma protocols, staffing decisions, and which nurses were permitted to respond to trauma activations. He was in his early 50s, decorated in the way that hospital administrators get decorated plaques and certificates, and a photograph with the governor that had been hanging on his office wall for six years. He was charming in public settings and methodical in private ones, and he had decided, within approximately 3 weeks of Nora transferring to Hargrove General 14 months ago, that she was a liability. He had not said directly. He had said it through protocols. 8 months ago, he had instituted a policy requiring all trauma response nurses to complete an updated certification in auditory monitoring, a requirement that did not exist in any state nursing board standards that he had written specifically for this hospital, and that included a component assessing real-time acoustic patient cue recognition. It was, in the plainest possible reading, a certification designed so that Nora could not pass it. She had appealed through HR. The appeal had been reviewed by a committee that included 2 physicians from Slade's department. Policy stood. Nora was no longer permitted to respond to trauma activations. She worked med-surg. She did her job. She didn't fight in the open. But she noticed everything. That was the thing nobody in this building had fully understood yet, that when you spend years compensating for one missing sense, the others don't just maintain. They sharpen past what most people experience as normal. Nora read rooms the way other people read text. She watched the small physical tells that bodies make before conditions deteriorate. She caught the micro-expressions that told her a patient was in more pain than they were admitting, or less stable than the chart suggested, or going to need intervention before the next check. She had learned to work at a frequency that most of the staff here weren't trained to access because she had been trained somewhere else in conditions that did not allow for the luxury of missing things. That somewhere else was something she never talked about at Hargrove General. She went back to her rounds. The helicopter came in at 11:23. Nora was in the medication room when she felt the vibration through the floor, the rotors of something large settling onto the rooftop landing pad. She knew from the she knew from the quality of the vibration that it wasn't one of the standard life helicopters the hospital received from regional transfer centers. The frequency was different, heavier. Military-grade rotors produced a different signature against concrete than civilian aircraft. And she knew that signature without having to think about it. She moved to the window at the end of the corridor. 3 floors below in the ambulance bay, she could see the preparation activity trauma team being paged, portable equipment being moved. Then the elevator from the rooftop opened in the lobby, visible from her vantage point, and a gurney came through at the kind of speed that meant someone was hemorrhaging and not doing it slowly. The man on the gurney was large, broad-shouldered, in his late 50s, dressed in what remained of a military uniform, with most of the upper portion cut away. Even from 3 floors up, the neck wound was visible, a dark, saturated mass of bandaging that had soaked through completely, which meant that whatever was underneath had not been adequately controlled. 2 men in tactical clothing flanked the gurney, moving with the deliberate efficiency of people who operated in environments where careless movement got people killed. Nora recognized the posture before she recognized anything else. She had seen that way of moving for years. She looked at the man on the gurney. She looked at the wound. Her hand tightened on the windowsill. Then she went back to her rounds because she was not permitted to be in that trauma room, and because the rules were the rules until they weren't. She checked on her patient 414, who had developed a low-grade fever overnight that Nora had flagged to the overnight resident and that still hadn't been addressed with the additional cultures she'd recommended. She noted it again. She changed the dressing on her patient in 417. She sat with the woman in 420 for 6 minutes because the woman had been asking for her family to be contacted and nobody had done it yet, and Nora had made the call herself 2 days ago, but was now following up to confirm. A visit was scheduled. 16 minutes after the helicopter arrived, she heard the overhead page. Not heard, felt, and saw because she was positioned near the nursing station with a line of sight to the display board where code activations registered. Trauma 1 Code Alpha, all available personnel. Code Alpha wasn't standard trauma language. It was the designation, Hargrove General, used for a patient in cardiac arrest during active resuscitation, someone whose heart had stopped and who required everything the department had simultaneously. Stood very still. Then the second page. Requesting surgical consult, vascular immediate. The vascular surgeon on call was Dr. Patricia Odom. Nora knew, because she made it her business to know the schedules of people who mattered in a hospital, that had been in a procedure since 9 this morning that was not expected to conclude until at least noon. 25 minutes from now, minimum. Probably more. Nora also knew from 14 months of working in this building that the ER attending currently managing that trauma room was Victor Slade. She put down her chart tablet. She walked to the stairwell. She didn't go to the trauma room. Not yet. She went to the supply court outside it, a narrow passage used for equipment staging that had a reinforced window looking into Trauma 1, the kind of window that existed so that staff could monitor situations without adding bodies to an already crowded space. Stood at that window and she watched. What she saw made her jaw tighten. The Admiral, and she was certain, now that it was an Admiral, she could see the insignia on the portion of uniform that hadn't been cut away, was showing a blood pressure of 64/30 on the monitor. His neck wound had been partially unpacked, and Slade was attempting to manage the hemorrhage with direct pressure and what appeared to be topical hemostatic agent, which was the correct first response to many bleeding wounds, but was not going to be sufficient for what Nora could see from the window. The wound pattern, the location, the way the blood was continuing to well up around the packed gauze rather than slowing it, was not a surface bleed. It was deep vascular involvement, and it needed surgical management that direct pressure alone could not provide. Slade called for a rhythm check. The monitor showed sinus tachycardia, with diminishing amplitude, the electrical pattern of a heart trying to maintain function with not enough blood to push. He's converting, someone said. Cardiovert at 50, Slade ordered. Nora pressed her hand flat against the window glass. Cardioversion was appropriate for certain unstable arrhythmias. This patient did not have an arrhythmia. He had hemorrhagic shock. His heart was not misbehaving electrically. It was running out of fuel. Shocking it would not restore his pressure. It would not replace the blood volume he was losing. It might, depending on where his electrical conduction stood right now, destabilize the rhythm he did have. She watched the defibrillator charge. She watched the team clear. She watched them deliver the shock. The monitor flatlined for 2 seconds, then resumed the same deteriorating pattern. Again, Slade said. One of the tactical men standing at the perimeter of the room, the one with the calm, particular stillness of someone who had seen a lot of people in a lot of trauma rooms, turned and looked at the window. He looked directly at Nora. His expression didn't change, but something in it asked a question she recognized. She held his gaze for 1 moment. Then she pushed open the corridor door. The trauma room was cold and loud in the specific way that rooms become when controlled panic has taken hold, everyone moving, everyone talking, the monitor alarms creating a layer of sound over everything else. Nora had spent enough time in environments like this that the noise sorted itself automatically into signal and background. Came in through the side entry and positioned herself 2 feet from the head of the gurney before anyone registered her. Then Slade saw her, Voss. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who was dealing with a problem and had just found a new one. You're not authorized to be in this room. His neck wound has carotid involvement, she said. Kept her voice level because she had learned that calm in emergency situations was more persuasive than urgency, and because she needed the room to hear her. Direct pressure won't control it. He needs the vessel exposed and clamped before he loses the rhythm entirely. I'm not going to stand here and discuss diagnosis with a floor nurse. Slade had already turned back to the patient. Someone get her out. Nobody moved to do it immediately, which told her something about the room. His pressure is 58. The resident monitoring the board said. I know what his pressure is. You've shocked him twice, Nora said. It hasn't changed anything because the problem isn't electrical. He's empty. He needs volume, and he needs that vessel controlled. You have, she glanced at the monitor, probably 4 minutes before the rhythm degrades past the point where volume will save him. Slade turned around fully. There was something in his face that she recognized the specific expression of a man who was being contradicted in front of witnesses and was deciding in real time how much of the situation he could afford to escalate. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. The blood pressure now read 51. She's not leaving. the tactical man from the perimeters said. He said it quietly, from across the room, without moving. But the quality of his voice made everyone in the room recalibrate slightly. Slade stared at him. My orders, the man said, in the same quiet tone, are to ensure this patient survives. If she stays him alive, she stays. 2 seconds of silence that felt much longer. Then the monitor alarm shifted, pitch, a sound that everyone in the room who knew what they were doing understood immediately. He's converting to V-fib, the resident said, with a tightness in his voice that meant they were out of time for the other conversation. Slade looked at Nora. She had already moved. I need a vascular clamp, number 40 proline suture, and 2 units of O-negative blood going now. Her voice had changed, not louder, but structured differently, carrying the cadence of someone who had given orders in rooms where orders were the difference between one outcome and another. Who's circulating? A nurse named Jamie, who Nora had passed in the hallway 100 times without exchanging more than scheduling information, raised her hand. With me, Nora said. Everyone else stay out of my way. Slade opened his mouth. The monitor alarm screamed. He closed it, and Nora Voss, the deaf nurse, from the medical surgical floor, who had not been permitted near a trauma patient in 8 months, put on gloves and went to work. She found the bleeder in 40 seconds. The carotid was damaged, not severed, which would have been unsurvivable in this setting, but lacerated in a way that had been bleeding steadily into the surrounding tissue, building pressure against the vessel wall while the external wound presented as manageable. It was the kind of injury that looked controlled from the outside until it wasn't. She applied direct vessel pressure with 2 fingers positioned to occlude flow without collapsing the vessel. Then walked Jamie through positioning the retractors while she assessed the damage under the light. Her hands were completely steady. She had noticed, somewhere in the first 20 seconds, that her hands were steady and had set the observation aside as irrelevant. 40 proline, she said. Jamie placed it. She began the suture. The room was very quiet. Not silent, the monitors were still running. Someone was calling out pressure readings. The resident was managing the resuscitation, but the particular noise of controlled panic had stopped. The room had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity without anyone formally deciding to do it. Slade stood 6 feet away. She was aware of him, the way she was aware of everything in a room completely, peripherally, without letting the awareness pull her attention from what her hands were doing. The first suture landed clean. The second. She worked with the specific economy of someone who had learned these techniques in conditions where wasted movement cost time and time cost people. She was not fast in the showy way. She was fast in the accurate way, which looked different and was better. Pressure's coming up, the resident said, with a note in his voice that mixed relief and confusion in about equal measure. 68/40. The tactical man who had spoken earlier moved slightly forward for his position against the wall, caught the movement in her peripheral vision, but didn't look up. Placed the final suture. She held pressure for 90 seconds while she assisted the repair. The bleeder had stopped. She straightened. The monitor showed a heart rate of 91 and a blood pressure of 74/46, still low, still needing volume and monitoring and eventual surgical follow-up, but a living number. A number that meant someone was going to make it out of this room. His back, the resident exhaled. Jamie, the circulating nurse, was staring at Nora with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Then the tactical man stepped all the way forward. He was in his late 30s, hard-built in the way that came from years of physical work rather than gym aesthetics, with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. And something in his expression shifted into something she had not seen directed at her in a very long time. Angel, he said. Not a question. She went very still. The name hit her like cold water, like a sound she had completely stopped expecting to hear in any room, spoken by any voice. She had spent 3 years making sure that name stayed buried, and now it was in this room, in the air between her and this man, in the 14 months of invisible, careful, anonymous work she had built at Hargrove General was already starting to fracture. She looked at him directly. She kept her face neutral with the practice of someone who had spent years learning to control what showed on it. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just looked at her with the expression of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and was making the decision about what to do with that knowledge. Behind her, Victor Slade was standing very still, and the quality of his stillness had changed. And on the gurney, Admiral James Caldwell, 3-star commander, the man she had just pulled back from the edge, opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the lights. Then, as if he had known exactly where she would be standing, he turned his head and found her face. His right hand lifted slowly, with the effort of someone who had just spent 20 minutes on the wrong side of death, and came up in the recognizable shape of a formal military salute. Nora stood motionless. In the silence of that trauma room, with Slade watching, and the resident watching, and the tactical man who had said her name watching, Admiral James Caldwell held that salute and looked at her like she was someone he had been waiting to find. And something in the room, in the air, in the dynamic, in the invisible hierarchy that had spent 14 months making her feel like she was barely worth the space she occupied, cracked open. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. The salute held the Admiral's arm, trembling with the effort, the hand imprecise, but the intention unmistakable, and the trauma room had gone so quiet that Nora could hear the IV pump cycling through its delivery sequence. She stood at the foot of the gurney with blood on her gloves and the suture package still open on the instrument tray beside her. And she felt the weight of every person in that room pressing against her from all sides, waiting to see what she would do. She made a decision in the space of a breath. She brought her right hand up, clean side out, and returned the salute. It lasted 2 seconds. She dropped her hand. She pulled off her gloves and turned to the resident. "He needs another unit of O negative, then type and cross for 2 more. Monitor his pressure every 3 minutes. If it drops below 60 systolic, call me." The resident blinked. "Call you?" "Yes." She didn't wait for him to process it. She moved to the sink, ran the water, and began washing her hands with the methodical attention she gave to every clinical task, because the alternative was standing in the middle of the room, feeling the full weight of what had just happened, and she wasn't ready to do that yet. Victor Slade had not moved from his position 6 feet behind her. She knew this the way she knew where every object in a room was through the peripheral information she'd trained herself to collect without looking. He was standing with his arms at his sides and his chin slightly elevated, which was his default architecture when he was recalibrating. Tactical man, the one who had said her name, stepped up beside her at the sink. Not crowding her, just present. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "Soon." "I know that, too." She finished washing, dried her hands, and turned to face the room. Slade was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not contempt, not dismissal, but something more complicated and less comfortable, the look of a man processing a significant miscalculation and not entirely sure yet what it meant for him. She met his eyes. He looked away first. She walked out of the trauma room. She made it to the supply corridor before her hands started shaking. Not from fear, she had long since separated fear from adrenaline as biological events, learned to function through both from the specific physiological release that comes after sustained high-focus performance. When the body finally gets the signal that the immediate crisis has passed and begins to discharge what it's been holding. Pressed her back against the wall, folded her hands together, and breathed through it for 45 seconds until the tremor passed. Then she thought about the name. Angel. She had not been called that in 3 years. 2 months and approximately 18 days, which she knew not because she'd been counting, but because she remembered the last time clearly a hospital in a different country, a different kind of chaos, a decision she had made in approximately 4 seconds that had ended her military career and saved the lives of 11 people and destroyed something else she hadn't fully assessed the cost of until much later. She had come to Sacramento to disappear. Not dramatically, she hadn't changed her name, hadn't moved to another country, hadn't constructed an elaborate cover. She had simply become Nora Voss, floor nurse, and relied on the fact that people in civilian hospitals don't look at floor nurses very hard. She had been right about that. For 14 months, nobody had looked at her hard at all. She pushed off the wall and went back to her floor. Her patients needed her. Room 414 still had the unresolved fever. The woman in 420 had a family visit scheduled for 2 o'clock that Nora had helped coordinate, and the patient was anxious about it in the specific way of someone who hadn't seen her daughter in 5 months and was afraid the daughter would be frightened by how she looked now. Robert in 408 was due for wound reassessment. She moved through all of it with the automatic competence of someone who had learned to compartmentalize not as a psychological coping mechanism, but as a practical operational skill. You put the thing that wasn't currently actionable in a separate drawer, and you worked with what was in front of you. Diane Pryor found her at the nursing station at 12:40. Dr. Slade wants to see you. Diane's voice had a quality Nora hadn't heard in it before, not quite caution, but something adjacent to it. When? Now, he said. I have a wound reassessment in 12 minutes. He said, now, Nora? She looked at Diane. She had never been able to fully determine whether Diane was a cruel person or simply an incurious one, whether the things she said and did came from malice or from the particular laziness of someone who had never had to examine their own biases because they'd never had consequences for them. Looking at her now, Nora still couldn't tell. Tell him I'll be there after the wound assessment, she said. Diane opened her mouth. 12 minutes, Nora said. My patient doesn't stop being my patient because he wants to see me. She went and did the wound assessment. It took 14 minutes because there was a section of the incision, early signs of dehiscence, that needed to be documented carefully, photographed, and flagged for surgical review. She did all of it. Then she went downstairs. Slade's office was the kind of space that communicated institutional authority through accumulation, the wall of framed credentials, the large desk, the chair arrangement that put visitors slightly lower than the person behind the desk, which was a design choice that she doubted he'd made consciously, but that he benefited from regardless. He was sitting when she came in, which confirmed that the conversation was meant to be on his terms. He did not offer her a seat. She took one anyway. Something moved through his expression at that, a brief recalibration. And then he settled back into the composed authority he wore publicly. What you did today was a direct violation of hospital protocol, he said. The trauma exclusion policy kept an Admiral from dying, she said. It's not what it was designed to do, I know. It's what happened. Slade's jaw tightened slightly. The policy exists because there are documented concerns about your ability to safely monitor. You wrote that policy. She said it without heat, as a fact. 14 months ago, after I transferred here from Mercy Regional, you wrote a certification requirement that specifically targeted my disability. No other hospital in the state has an equivalent requirement, and it doesn't correspond to any nursing board standard. The silence that followed was about 2 seconds long and a serious allegation. It's a serious observation. I didn't say allegation. She looked at him steadily. I've been keeping records, Dr. Slade. Every policy adjustment, every protocol change, every incident where I was blocked from patient care, and the documented outcome of those blocks. I kept them because I thought I might need them someday. Today changed the timeline of when someday might be. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the calculation of what she had, what he had, what the morning's events had shifted in the balance between them. He was an intelligent man. She had never underestimated that. Intelligence didn't prevent the kind of institutional bias he practiced. Sometimes it made it more sophisticated. The tactical personnel who accompanied Admiral Caldwell have been asking about you, he said, and the shift in subject was itself information. He was moving away from the policy grounds to something else. Specifically, the man who spoke to you in the trauma room. She waited. They'd like a meeting. The Admiral's protective detail, apparently, has some connection to you. His voice gave away nothing, but his eyes were doing something more careful. That's going to create a complicated situation for the hospital. For the hospital, she said. For everyone. I'll handle the meeting on my own time, she said. Is there a clinical reason you needed to see me? Or was this it? Another pause. Shorter. Don't go near the trauma unit again without authorization, he said. She stood. I'll note that in my records. The instruction and the date. She left without waiting for a response. The tactical man found her first. She was coming out of the stairwell onto the third floor at 1:15 when he was simply there, standing in the corridor, sped in a way that suggested he had known which route she would take, which told her something about the kind of work he did. Up close, he was younger than she'd initially assessed, early 40s. Maybe with the weathered quality that outdoor operational work puts on faces faster than years do. The scar along his jaw was old. His eyes were the kind of alert that didn't switch off when the immediate situation didn't demand it. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Reeves, he said, though I imagine you've already figured out I'm not here in a standard protective capacity. JSOX, she said. He didn't confirm or deny it, which was its own confirmation. You saved his life. He would have had about 3 more minutes. Maybe less. Odom wouldn't have made it in time. No. He looked at her for a moment with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of someone who had no reason to waste either of their time with social maneuvering. He's asking for you, the Admiral. She felt the pull of that, the specific gravity of a person whose life you have held in your hands asking to see you, and she also felt the resistance to it. Part of her that understood that walking into that room would accelerate everything that walking into the trauma room had already started. He's conscious, she asked. In and out. But when he's in, he's asking for Angel. Reeves paused. He knows who you are. He's known for a while. Something shifted in her chest at that not surprise, exactly, but the particular weight of discovering that a truth you'd been protecting had been known by someone else all along? How long? She asked. 14 months, Reeves said. He found out when you transferred here. He stopped choosing the word. Watching. Making sure you were okay. She stared at him. Why you're here, she said. This wasn't random. The mission that brought us here was real. The routing, he looked at her steadily. He requested this hospital specifically. Hargrove General is not the closest trauma facility to our insertion point. The corridor was empty except for the 2 of them, and the sounds of the floor, the monitors, the distant PA system. The ordinary noise of a hospital at work continued around them, with complete indifference to what was being said. Nora looked down at the floor for a moment. She thought about 14 months of people not seeing her. She thought about the policy Slade had written. She thought about the certification requirement designed to keep her away from trauma cases and the charge nurse's comments about her IV insertion, and Finch's gesture toward the side of her head, and the 100 small daily calculations she made about how much to push back and how much to absorb, because she didn't have the institutional standing to fight everything. And she thought about an admiral routing a military transport to a specific hospital to make sure she was okay. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She set it aside. I'll come when my shift ends, she said. 5 o'clock. Reeves nodded. He handed her a card, plain white, a room number written in pen. Nothing else. He'll be awake. He walked toward the elevator. She watched him go, then turned and went back to her patients. The afternoon didn't slow down the way afternoons sometimes did on MedSurg. Room 414's fever spiked to 101.8 at 2:30, and Nora spent 40 minutes coordinating with the covering resident, not Finch, a younger physician named Waller, who was newer to the hospital and had not yet developed the habit of dismissing nurses reflexively to get the additional blood cultures ordered and a urology consult placed. The woman in 420 had her family visit, produced the kind of complicated emotion that family visits in hospitals produce, the relief and the grief and the exhaustion, all occupying the same space simultaneously. And Nora sat with her for 10 minutes afterward, because the patient needed someone too, and because sometimes that was what nursing was. 3:40, Jamie from the trauma room appeared on the MedSurg floor. Nora was at the nursing station, updating charts, when she noticed her standing at the edge of the corridor, looking uncertain in the way that people look when they've decided to do something and are now second-guessing the approach. Nora recognized the expression because she'd seen it on people who had something to say that they hadn't said before. She waited. Jamie came over. She stopped. Started again. I wanted to say something. Okay, Nora said. What you did this morning. Jamie looked at her hands briefly, then back up. I've been circulating in trauma for 3 years. I've seen a lot of procedures. She stopped again. I know what it was, Nora said, not unkindly. I didn't know you had that kind of training. Most people don't. Jamie was quiet for a moment. Dr. Slade is telling people you violated protocol. He's going to bring it to the medical executive committee. She said it quickly, like she'd been holding it and needed to release it. I thought you should know that. He was on the phone this afternoon with legal. Nora absorbed that. Thank you for telling me. I should have. Jamie hesitated. I've heard things in that department about why you're not allowed in trauma. I never really questioned whether the policy made sense. She looked uncomfortable. I'm questioning it now. That's a start, Nora said, and she meant it without sarcasm. After Jamie left, Nora sat for a moment at the nursing station. The medical executive committee. Legal. Slade was moving faster than she'd expected, which meant the morning had unsettled him more than he'd shown in the office. Men who were confident in their position didn't call legal the same afternoon. They called legal when they were worried about the shape of what was coming. She thought about her records. She had them organized on an encrypted drive. 3 years of careful documentation, dates and times and specifics, a practice she'd started not with any particular plan, but simply because she had learned, over the course of her life, the world often didn't record things the way they actually happened, and someone needed to. She thought about Slade's face when she'd told him she'd been keeping records. Then she finished her charts, handed off her patients to the evening nurse, and went to find room 412. The room was at the end of the east wing on the second floor, cordoned off from the regular ward by 2 personnel she identified immediately as protective security, civilian clothing, military posture, kind of watchful stillness that security guards who'd never deployed didn't quite manage to replicate. One of them stepped forward when she approached. She gave him the card Reeves had written on. He looked at it. He looked at her badge. He stepped aside. Inside, the room had been reconfigured in the small ways that protective details reconfigure spaces. Furniture moved to create specific sight lines. One chair positioned near the door that was clearly occupied by whoever was maintaining close watch. Reeves was in that chair. He nodded at her when she came in. Admiral James Caldwell was propped at about 30 degrees on the hospital bed, his neck immobilized in a soft collar, an IV running into his left arm. Monitors attached and reading steady numbers that told her his pressure had climbed to acceptable levels, and his rhythm had held. He looked like a man who had spent a significant portion of the day unconscious and was using what clarity he had very deliberately. His eyes tracked to her immediately when she came through the door. Stopped at the foot of the bed. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was the face of someone who had been in operational environments for long enough that it showed, weathered and precise, the kind of face that had made a lot of decisions, and not all of them easy ones. "Sit down, petty officer," he said. His voice was hoarse from the intubation they'd apparently placed and removed during the resuscitation. But it carried. She sat. "You're angry," he said. She considered denying it. "Some. You have every right to be. You routed a transport here," she said. "You've been monitoring me for 14 months. You didn't make contact." "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you didn't want to be found," he said. "And because I owed you enough to respect that. What I did, what happened in Kandahar, I didn't have the right to walk back into your life on my terms." Kandahar. The name sat in the room between them. She had not said that word out loud in 3 years. "But you routed the transport here," she said again. "I needed the best trauma care available for a mission-critical situation," he said. "You were it. Both things can be true." She looked at him. She was trying to determine whether she believed that, and she found, with some irritation, that she did, because it was the kind of reasoning that was both self-serving and genuinely logical. And she had known enough admirals to understand that those two things were not mutually exclusive in the people who reached that rank. "Your record is sealed," he said, shifting. "It was sealed for operational security reasons after Kandahar. It shouldn't have stayed sealed this long. That's on me. There was a bureaucratic process that I should have pushed harder." He stopped. His face tightened briefly. "I didn't. And you've been here for 14 months while a hospital administrator has been treating you like." He stopped again, and something in his expression clarified into something harder. "I read the accommodation denial documentation. Reeves pulled Slade's policy." She was quiet. "How long has he been doing it?" "Since I arrived," she said. "He decided within the first month, and you've been documenting it." "Yes." The Admiral's eyes moved to Reeves and back. "We need to talk about what comes next," he said, "because today changed the situation in several directions simultaneously, and I want to make sure you're informed before anything moves without you." "What directions?" Reeves answered from the door. "The men who came in with the Admiral, 2 of them, have been in contact with command since we landed. There's a JAG officer on a flight from Coronado. The Admiral's testimony relates to a significant matter that's been under investigation for some time, and his arrival here, the fact that it happened at this hospital, the way it happened has accelerated a timeline." She looked at Reeves. "What kind of investigation?" He and the Admiral exchanged a brief look. "The kind," the Admiral said carefully. That involves people who would prefer I hadn't made it to a trauma room." She felt the sentence land. "The neck wound," she said slowly. "The mission profile was not a standard operational situation," Caldwell said. "I'll leave it there for now. But I want you to understand that what happened this morning has visibility at a level above this hospital, and that visibility is going to come down on this building in the next 24 to 48 hours. She thought about Slade calling legal. She thought about the medical executive committee. She thought about what it would mean to be the floor nurse at the center of that kind of incoming. "And me," she said. "Your record," Caldwell said, "is going to be unsealed. It's not a favor. That's a correction of something that should have happened 3 years ago. What you do with it after." He looked at her steadily. "That's yours." She sat with that for a moment. Outside the door, the hospital continued its afternoon business, the PA system, the wheel of a cart in the corridor, the ordinary, undramatic sound of a place where people were trying to stay alive. Inside this room, the world she had built for herself, over 14 months of careful invisibility, was coming apart at the seams, and the man who had been the origin point of her disappearing was the one sitting in the hospital bed. She'd just kept him alive to occupy. She was about to say something when Reeves's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His expression didn't change much, But something in his posture shifted in the way that bodies shift when a situation has just become more urgent. "We have a problem," he said. Caldwell looked at him. Hospital security flagged a group in the parking structure. 3 vehicles. They've been stationary for 40 minutes. He turned the phone so the Admiral could see it, then held it toward Nora. The image on the screen was from a security camera, a wide shot of the concrete interior of a parking garage, 3 dark SUVs, and between them, visible at the edge of the frame, the tactical posture of men who were not waiting to pick someone up from an appointment. Nora looked at the image. She looked at the way the men stood. She had seen men stand that way before, in different places, in different light, and she knew exactly what it meant and about what they were there to do. "How many exits does this building have?" Reeves said, but he wasn't asking Nora, he was already on another call. Voice low, and the room's energy had transformed completely. Caldwell looked at her. "You should go up to your floor," he said. "This is not your—" "How many of your people are in this building?" she said. He paused. "Reeves and 2 others. Against how many in that garage?" He didn't answer immediately. "James," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without rank, and she watched the small effect it had on his face. "How many?" "At least 6, Reeves said, lowering his phone. "Possibly more. They've been watching the building since we landed." The floor hummed with the low frequency of the hospital's climate systems, and, above that, the ordinary sounds of the afternoon. None of the patients on any of the floors above them knew that parking garage 3 levels below had just changed everything about what the next several hours were going to look like. Nora stood. She thought about the 419 patients on her floor. She thought about Robert professionally, she thought about Robert in 408 and the woman in 420 and the resident who was managing the fever in 414 without adequate backup. She thought about 87 patients distributed across 4 floors of this building who had no idea what was parked 3 levels below them. She thought about the last time she had been in a building when people with weapons came through the doors and how fast everything had moved, and what the difference between action and reaction had meant in that building. "You need to call the hospital administrator," she said. "Full lockdown. Now, not in 20 minutes, now." Reeves was already nodding. "And I need a radio." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression she had spent years not showing inside this building, the one that was not the floor nurse, not the woman who got blocked from trauma certifications, not the person Diane Pryor talked about near the nursing station. Reeves reached to his belt and handed her a secondary unit without saying a word. Behind them, Admiral Caldwell watched her clip it to the side of her practiced motion of someone who had worn a radio in more serious circumstances than a hospital corridor, and his expression held something she would not have been able to describe precisely, but that might have been, in its own complicated way, recognition. Then the radio crackled, and the voice on the other end said 6 words that made the hair on Nora's arms stand up. "They're already inside the building." The words came through the radio with the flat certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than a warning. And the room shifted the way rooms shift when the nature of a situation changes completely, not with noise or visible panic, but with a compression of attention, everyone's focus narrowing to the same point at the same time. Reeves was already moving. He crossed to the door in 4 steps, cracked it, looked both directions down the corridor, and pulled it shut again. "2 confirmed inside on the ground floor," he said, not to the room in general, but to the specific geometry of the problem. "Weston has eyes on them near the main stairwell." "Armed?" Nora said. "Weston thinks concealed carry, at least." "They're not showing anything yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence." Nora clipped the radio to her scrubs pocket and looked at the room, the Admiral's bed, the monitor lines, the IV setup, the chair positions, the single window, that looked out onto the hospital's east courtyard. She ran the geometry without thinking about it, the way she had learned to run it years ago, when geometry meant the difference between someone going home and someone not going home. Can't be moved, she said. Not with that repair. I know, Reeves said. Then we're defending this room. Caldwell had pulled himself slightly more upright against the pillow, which he should not have done, and she noted the fact without addressing it yet. What assets do we have? He said. Reeves ran it quickly. Weston on the ground floor tracking the two contacts. Marcus is on the stairwell access to this wing, second floor junction. I'm here. He paused. That's 3 against minimum 6, and that's assuming the parking structure count was accurate, which it probably wasn't. Radio to the protective detail coordinator? Already sent the situation report. Response unit is 22 minutes out. 22 minutes was a long time when people with weapons were already inside a building. Nora knew this from direct experience, and she set the knowledge aside as a variable she could not change, and therefore didn't need to spend attention on. Hospital security, she said. I'm telling them to lock down, not to engage, Reeves said. They're not equipped for this. Agreed. Who manages patient communications from Central? The administrator's office triggers the PA. Call them now. Code Silver. She watched Reeves process that briefly. Active shooter protocol. Gets patients locked up in rooms, staff away from corridors, all external doors sealed by security automatically. The hospital's already set up to do it. They just need the activation. He was already on his phone. Nora turned to Caldwell. I need you lying flat and staying there. I'm not Admiral. She said it with enough weight that it landed. If you reopen that repair I did this morning, there is no second procedure available to you in this building. Flat. Now, he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being told what to do and was making an active choice to override that. He lay back. She adjusted his monitor alarm thresholds, quickly not disabling them, but raising the sensitivity floor so that minor movement artifacts wouldn't trigger false alerts that would make noise at the wrong moment. Then she checked the IV line, the fluid rate, the pressure cuff cycling. His systolic was holding at 82. Not good, but not actively deteriorating. PA system came alive overhead with the flat, measured tone that hospital emergency announcements use specifically because the measured quality is supposed to prevent panic and rarely fully succeeds. Attention all staff and visitors. This is a Code Silver notification. Please follow established emergency protocols immediately. All patients remain in your rooms. All staff report to designated shelter positions. This is not a drill. The effect was immediate and imperfect, the way these things always are. She could hear it through the walls, the sudden increase in corridor noise, voices, the sound of doors, someone down the hall asking a question she couldn't fully make out. Real emergencies don't produce the clean compliance that drills do. People freeze. People move toward the noise instead of away from it. People stand in corridors asking each other what's happening because the human brain's response to sudden threat includes a social component that protocol designers consistently underestimate. Reeves ended his call. Code Silver is active. Security is sealing external doors. They have 2 guards on this wing's stairwell access. What kind of guards? He looked at her. Armed, standard hospital security. Sidearms, no tactical training. She thought about that. Keep them at the access point, but tell them their job is containment, not confrontation. If someone comes through, they hold and report. They don't engage. They won't like that. They'll be alive to not like it, she said. Do it. He relayed the instruction. On the monitor, Caldwell's heart rate had climbed to 98, not from physical exertion, because he was lying flat, but from the particular physiological response to stress that even disciplined people don't fully suppress. She watched the number and said nothing about it. The radio crackled. Weston's voice tighter than before. Two contacts, now four. They split, two heading for the east stairwell, two holding near the main desk. The desk staff complied with Code Silver and moved to shelter. The contacts are at the elevator bank. How long to this floor by elevator? Nora said to Reeves. 40 seconds. She looked at the door. The next 6 minutes had a specific texture that she recognized from other circumstances, the way that time before a breach compresses and expands simultaneously, stretching out each individual second while somehow also accelerating toward the moment of contact. She had felt it in other buildings, other corridors. She had never expected to feel it in a hospital where she worked. Reeves positioned himself to the left of the door, back to the wall, where the door's swing would partially conceal him from anyone entering. Took the right side, which put the Admiral's bed in her peripheral vision, and the door at an angle she could monitor without standing directly in its path. It was not a sophisticated defensive setup. It was what the room allowed. The radio stayed quiet for 3 minutes, which was worse in some ways than noise. Then Weston's voice again. East stairwell contacts are on 2, moving toward the south wing junction. That's the other end of our floor, Reeves said to her quietly. How many patients in the south wing? 14 rooms, probably 11 occupied. She thought about those 11 rooms. She thought about the people in them. People in various states of recovery, connected to IV lines and monitors. People who had come here specifically because they were vulnerable and needed the building to be safe. Code Silver protocol would have them locked in their rooms with doors closed, which was the correct response, and also meant they were stationary targets if someone moved through the wing without anyone to slow them down. She looked at Reeves. Marcus is on the stairwell junction? Second floor. Not this floor. Get him up here. South wing junction. That leaves the second floor stairwell open. The contacts are already past the second floor, she said. Marcus is more useful here than covering ground they've already moved through. Reeves relayed it. A pause. Then Marcus confirmed. She had 30 seconds, maybe 40, while he repositioned. She looked at the room and made a decision that she was not entirely comfortable with, and made it anyway, because the alternative was worse. She went to the supply cabinet on the wall, the standard one present in all patient ret rooms for SASIC's clinical materials, and opened it. Rolled gauze, tape, an irrigation syringe, 2-liter bags of saline. Took the saline bags and the syringes and moved them to the bedside table where they would be in reach, without requiring her to cross the room. Reeves watched her do it without comment. He understood why. Your hands, he said quietly, meaning, what can you do beyond medicine? She had been asked versions of this question before, in other circumstances, by people assessing the same variable. Enough, she said, which was what she had always said, because it was true, and because the more specific answer took longer than the situation ever allowed. He nodded. Then the noise started. Not a dramatic noise. Not the movie version of a breach. It was a door handle, the fire exit at the end of the south wing corridor, audible as a metallic sound that didn't fit the ambient texture of the floor, and then a brief pause, and then a sound she recognized as careful footsteps on linoleum from someone who was moving with deliberate quiet and not quite achieving it, because deliberate quiet is a skill, and not everyone who carries a weapon has developed it to the same level. She pressed back against the wall. Reeves's hand moved to his sidearm. The radio produced a short burst of static that might have been Weston trying to transmit with noise masking him the signal, and then nothing. 12 seconds of silence. Then a voice from the south end of the corridor, flat, professional, not raised. Staff personnel, identify yourself and remain stationary. She recognized the quality of it immediately. Not security theater. Operational. Someone who had done this before. No answer from the corridor. Then a second voice, further away, that she couldn't fully hear, and then a sharp, percussive sound that her brain processed in about a quarter second as a suppressed discharge which meant someone in the corridor had a weapon with noise reduction and had just used it. Something heavy fell against the wall outside the room. The monitor alarm fired Caldwell's heart rate, spiking to 114, and she crossed to it in 2 steps and manually silenced it. Not because the alarm didn't matter, but because sound was now a tactical liability, and she needed to be able to hear the corridor. Reeves had the door cracked, one eye on the gap. He held up 2 fingers. 2 contacts visible. She moved to the other side of the door frame. He held up a fist. Wait. She waited. A voice from outside. Closer. Conversational in the way that people who want to communicate control use conversational tones. We know he's in 412. We're not here for staff. Step back from the door, and nobody gets hurt. She had heard variations of this before, too. Reeves looked at her. His expression communicated the specific problem clearly. 2 of them, 2 contacts in the corridor, potentially more approaching, 1 protected person in the bed who could not under any circumstances be moved or excited to the point of cardiac stress. She held up 1 finger. 1 moment. She looked at the room. She looked at the door. She looked at the supply cabinet she'd already opened. Then she went to the cabinet, opened the second shelf, and found what she'd been looking for. The cardiac crash cart was not in this room. But every patient room in this wing had an emergency airway kit as a secondary placement, and the airway kit had exactly what she needed. She took the laryngoscope handle solid metal, weighted, not designed as a weapon, but functionally useful as one in the way that functional objects sometimes are, and positioned herself to the hinge side of the door. She looked at Reeves. He looked back at her with an expression that was not quite worry, and quite spec, but occupied some honest space between the 2. Then she nodded. He pushed the door open hard. What followed was not elegant, and she had not expected it to be. The door caught the closer of the 2 men in the shoulder, not disabling, but enough to push him off balance, and by the half-second margin, that was the only thing any of this was ever about. Reeves moved through the gap on the left. She went right, and the second man was faster than she'd assessed. Already turning, and she had to adjust mid-stride in a way that she felt in her left knee, in a way she'd been feeling in her left knee for 2 years every time she moved at speed. She connected with the laryngoscope against the man's forearm rather than his wrist, which was the intended target, because he moved, and the impact was hard enough to produce a sound, but not hard enough to make him drop what he was holding. She grabbed his wrist with her left hand, both of them against the corridor wall, and she was not under any illusion that this was sustainable. She was 34 years old, with a knee that gave her trouble on stairs, and he was larger than her by a significant margin. But she needed 3 seconds. She got 4. Reeves neutralized the first contact in that window, and then he was beside her. And the second man went down against the wall, with his weapon secured and his hands controlled, and the corridor was quiet again, in the sharp, immediate way that corridors become quiet when the violence in them stops. Straightened. Her knee was complaining. She ignored it. Reeves looked at her. "You okay?" "Fine." She wasn't entirely, but fine was accurate enough. They secured both men with the zip ties. Reeves had, in his vest, she learned that he had zip ties in his vest, which was information revised her assessment of how prepared he'd been for this scenario from the beginning. Both men were conscious and controlled. Neither was talking. She looked at the one closer to her, mid-30s, fit, expensive tactical footwear that wasn't any brand she recognized from standard military issue. Private contractor. She'd seen the type before, not military, not law enforcement, but something in between that occupied a space that the law hadn't fully figured out how to regulate. She went back into room 412. The Admiral's pressure was on the monitor at 79/44, which was lower than it had been 20 minutes ago. His heart rate had come down from the 114 spike, but was sitting at 107, which was elevated enough to concern her. The physical stress of the last 30 minutes, even without him doing anything except lying in a bed, had cost something. "How do you feel?" she said. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who knew the clinically correct answer was different from the personally honest one. "Like I died this morning," he said. "You did," she said. "Don't do it again." She checked his pressure cuff manually, confirming the reading, and adjusted the IV rate slightly. "Do you have any chest tightness? Shortness of breath?" "No." "Headache?" "Some." She looked at his eyes, checking for the subtle asymmetry that would indicate neurological involvement, which was a real concern with corroded repair in the first 12 hours. Pupils equal and reactive. She held up 2 fingers and asked him to track them. He did, smoothly. She noted it, updated her mental chart of his status, and kept her face professionally neutral, even though the headache was a data point she didn't love. "Reeves," she said without turning. "On it," he said, which meant he had already identified her concern and was already on the radio. Corridor outside was quiet in a way that felt temporarily rather than finally quiet. She had been in enough situations to know the difference. The 2 contacts Reeves had secured were part of a larger set, and the larger set still had most of its members unaccounted for. The response unit Reeves had called was still she checked the time 16 minutes out. 15 minutes. She looked at the door. She looked at the Admiral. She looked at the monitor. Then Weston's voice came through the radio, with a quality that told her, before the words arrived, that something had changed again. "We have a problem on the ground floor. They've got staff." Reeves keyed his radio. "How many?" 3 hospital employees. "They're using them to move through the lobby toward the east elevator bank. Security backed off, they had to. They're not going to shoot civilians." "Of course they aren't," Nora said, not loudly. "Weston, can you hold the elevator controls?" "Already tried." "Someone cut the security override on the 2nd floor. Elevators are unlocked." She looked at Reeves. "They're coming up," she said. "Yes. How long?" "If they're already at the elevator bank," he checked the door. 3 minutes, maybe less. She thought about the 3 staff members being moved through the lobby as human shields and felt the cold, specific anger that she'd felt in other situations where people were being used as cover. It was not an anger that produced noise or visible agitation. It produced clarity, which was the thing that anger was useful for when you trained it correctly. "The elevator opens 30 meters down the corridor," she said. "Between here and the South Wing Junction." "Yes." "Marcus is at the junction." "Yes." "If they come out of the elevator with staff as cover, Marcus can't engage without risk to the civilians." She was thinking out loud, working through the geometry. "But they'll have to move the staff into the wing corridor to use them as cover approaching this room. In the corridor, they're channeled single file at most 2 wide. That changes the geometry." Reeves watched her. "The staff members," she said. "Are they hospital employees?" Weston said staff. Didn't specify. She thought about who would be in the lobby during a Code Silver. Not nursing staff, they'd be in patient rooms per protocol. Not physicians, they'd be in procedure rooms or staff shelters. Lobby-level personnel during a Code Silver were most likely administrative staff, visitor services, someone who'd been near the entrance when the lockdown activated and hadn't made it to a shelter point in time. She picked up the radio. "Weston, this is Voss. The 3 staff members, what are they wearing?" Pause. 2 in street clothes, 1 in blue scrubs. "Blue scrubs. Which floor?" Another pause. "Badge color looks green." Green badge was facilities management, not clinical. Someone who didn't have a department shelter to report to and had probably been near the supply elevator when things started. She filed it. "When they come off the elevator," she said to Reeves, "the person in blue scrubs, if they're in the middle of the group, the contractors will keep them between themselves and any threat coming from the junction direction." "Right. But they won't be watching behind them. Not if they think they've already cleared the corridor." Reeves looked at her. She was thinking about the supply corridor access that ran parallel to this wing, the internal service passage that housekeeping used. She knew about because she had been the one to flag a maintenance issue in it 6 weeks ago and had walked it with the facilities manager. Connected to the main corridor at 2 points, one near the junction and one approximately 8 meters behind, where a group coming off the elevator would stop if they were assessing in the wing before moving forward. "I need to move," she said. "I'm not leaving this room," Reeves said, meaning the Admiral. "I know. I'm not asking you to." She picked up the radio, looked at Caldwell once, and said to him directly, "Do not let your pressure drop below 70. The alarm goes, you tell Reeves, and Reeves tells me." Caldwell looked at her with an expression that she didn't have time to interpret fully. "Voss," he said. She paused. "Be careful," he said. "That's an order." "Noted," she said, and left the room. The supply corridor access was behind the linen room, third door on the left past the nursing station. She moved along the wall rather than the center of the corridor, old habit, reducing the profile visible from any open doorway, and reached the linen room in 11 seconds. Inside, the supply corridor door was unlocked, which it always was during active hospital operations, because the facilities team needed continuous access during the day. She eased it open, went through, and pulled it shut behind her. Sawson. The supply corridor was narrow, poorly lit by fluorescent strips on a motion sensor that activated as she moved. She killed 4 of them by reaching up and clicking them manually to their off position, plunging the section she'd already passed through into darkness. The strip ahead of her stayed on. She moved toward the second junction point and listened. She could hear the elevator, distant through the wall, the sound of doors, movement, voices at a level she could detect as vibration, rather than clearly hear. Pressed her hand against the wall and counted the quality of what she felt. Multiple people, moving with coordinated sequencing. She had maybe 90 seconds. She reached the junction point, a door that opened into the main corridor behind where they'd be stopping, and positioned herself flat against the wall beside it, with her hand on the handle. The radio was in her pocket, volume low, barely audible. She heard Weston's voice at a level. She could not fully parse through the fabric. She pressed her ear to the door instead and listened to the corridor directly. Footsteps. 6 sets. She counted the 3 contractors and the 3 staff members, and the contractors were distributing themselves with 1 at the front and 2 in the middle, managing the civilians, which was a rational formation for moving through a cleared space, but left nobody assigned to the rear. Stopped. She heard a voice she didn't recognize, one of the contractors, assessing the wing ahead of them. A flat exchange, a decision being made. She looked at the door handle in her hand. She thought about what was on the other side. 3 armed contractors. 3 frightened civilians. A hallway with 11 occupied patient rooms. And at the far end, a room where a man with a repaired carotid artery and a blood pressure of 79 was lying in a bed that she was not going to let anyone reach. She also thought, briefly and practically, about the fact that her knee hurt and she was a floor nurse in hospital scrubs without a weapon, and that everything she was about to do was going to depend entirely on timing, and the specific human tendency to not expect a threat from the direction you've already passed through. She took a slow breath. Then the handle moved in her hand, someone on the other side testing the door, and she felt it through her palm, and she had about 2 seconds before they opened it from their side. And she lost every advantage the position gave her. She opened it first. The contractor was right there, closer than she'd expected, his hand still on the handle. She drove the heel of her right hand into his chin before he could fully process what he was looking at. It was not a clean hit. She caught the edge of his jaw rather than the center, and he went into the wall rather than down. And she grabbed his weapon hand by reflex and shoved it against the door frame with all the weight she could generate. Corridor erupted. One of the civilians, the person in blue scrubs, dropped immediately, which was either training or pure survival instinct, and the drop took them out of the line of conflict as a liability. The second contractor at the back spun toward Nora, and she was already moving laterally, using the first contractor's body between her and the second man's position, which was the only viable defensive geometry available to her right now. Ground. Marcus's voice from the junction end loud, sharp, the command presence of someone who had issued that word in places where it needed to work immediately. Everyone down. Ground. Now. The two remaining contractors turned toward the voice. It was 3 seconds of complete chaos, in the way that physical confrontations always are not the choreographed exchange of fiction, but the fast, ugly, overlapping scramble of people making urgent decisions with incomplete information. And she had her knee against the floor from a move she hadn't fully controlled, and the contractor she'd hit was trying to recover against the wall, and she could hear Marcus and someone else, Weston, arriving from the stairwell, moving through the space with the efficiency of people who did this for a living. It lasted 11 seconds. Then the corridor was down to the sounds of breathing, and the 3 civilians were against the wall, wide-eyed and shaking. And all 3 contractors were on the floor, with weapons secured. And Marcus was looking at Nora over the nearest one with an expression that held in about equal measure professional assessment and what she interpreted as genuine concern. "You hit?" he said. She did a quick check. Her knee was worse. She'd landed on it in a way that told her she'd know more about the damage tomorrow, if tomorrow was the kind of thing that continued normally from here. Her right hand ached at the heel where she'd struck. "Nothing else." "No," she said. "South wing clear?" "Clear." "Ground floor?" "Weston's handling the last 2 contacts with security support." Marcus looked down the corridor. 6 total. That was the full count. She stood up from the floor, which her knee made its opinions about, and she pressed on. She looked at the 3 civilians against the wall, a woman in her 50s who was shaking but holding herself together, a young man who looked like he might be sick, and the person in blue scrubs who had dropped and stayed down, and was now pushing herself upright with the particular steadiness of someone who had decided that staying stone functional was the only response worth having. "Are you injured?" Nora said to them. The woman shook her head. The young man said, I don't think so." The person in blue scrubs said, "No," and then added, looking at Nora with something like confusion, "You work on 3. "Yes," Nora said. "You're the nurse." A pause. "The deaf nurse." "Yes," Nora said again. The person in blue scrubs looked at the contractor on the floor, then back at her, with an expression that she didn't have time to unpack. She was already moving back toward room 412. Caldwell's blood pressure had dropped to 71. She saw it on the monitor before she was fully through the door and crossed to the bed without stopping. His color was off not dramatically, but she saw it, the slight change in the quality of the skin around his mouth that told her perfusion was becoming marginal. "Talk to me," she said. "Still here," he said. His voice was more hoarse than it had been. She checked his neck, the bandaging over the repair site, looking for any sign of seepage. The dressing was clean. The repair itself was holding. The drop in pressure was from sustained stress and inadequate resuscitation, not from structural failure, which was the thing she'd been most afraid of since the corridor noise started. "I need another liter of normal saline running," she said. Wide open. Reeves was already on it. He'd clearly kept eyes on the monitor throughout the last several minutes, which told her he was tracking both threats simultaneously, which was the kind of competent she'd come to expect from him in the last 2 hours. Spiked the bag, ran the tubing, connected it. She elevated the foot of the bed slightly, improving venous return without changing the position of his head and neck. Stayed at his bedside with 2 fingers on his radial pulse because she trusted her hands more than she trusted a machine right now. His pulse was thready but present, rate coming down from the stress spike. She stayed there, counting. 40 seconds later, the monitor showed 76. 2 minutes later, 81. She exhaled very quietly. Is it over? Caldwell said. The immediate situation, she said. Yes, but not the other situation. She looked at him. Whoever sent those men, he said, isn't going to stop because this failed. No, she said. They won't. He was quiet for a moment. Reeves was on his radio in the far corner, voice low, coordinating with Weston and the arriving response team, whose distant sirens she could feel now as a low vibration through the building structure. There's something you need to know, Caldwell said. She waited. The operation in Kandahar, he said. The decision you made. The one that ended your career. He paused, and she watched the effort it cost him to keep his voice steady. There was an investigation. Afterward. Internal, classified. The conclusion? He stopped. Sir, the conclusion was that you were right, he said. The order you refused was illegal. The officer who issued it has been under federal investigation for 2 years. That's what testimony is about. Not just the corruption network, the specific chain of command decisions that violated the laws of armed conflict going back 6 years. He looked at her steadily. You were one of the first documented refusals. Your record was sealed, not to protect operational security. It was sealed to protect the people investigating you. She sat very still with that. The sirens were louder now. She could see through the window the lights of emergency vehicles in the hospital's east approach, federal vehicles, she thought. By the configuration, not just local law enforcement. She was still sitting with the information he'd just given her when the door to room 412 opened and a man she had never seen before came through it, not Reeves's team, not hospital security, but a man in a suit with a federal identification credential already visible and 2 uniformed agents behind him. He looked at the Admiral, he looked at Reeves. Then he looked at Nora, and something in his expression shifted into a focused attention that was different from anything she'd been on the receiving end of in 14 months in this building. Which one of you is Voss? He said. I am, she said. He looked at her, really. Looked. The way almost nobody in this hospital had ever looked at her, and then he said something that she had completely stopped expecting anyone, in a professional context, to say to her. We've been looking for you, he said. We need your testimony. And, before she could respond, Reeves's radio fired one final transmission, Weston's voice, from the ground floor, carrying a quality she'd never heard from him, before something between anger and disbelief. You need to come down here, Weston said. We found ID on the contractors. You're not going to believe who signed their contracts. Reeves was already moving toward the door before Weston finished the transmission, but Nora was closer and she got there first, which was not a competition, but simply the geography of the room. She looked back once at Caldwell. The monitor was reading 83 systolic, his rate at 89, numbers she could accept for the 3 minutes she was going to be away. And then she followed the federal agent into the corridor and toward the stairwell. The ground floor looked like the aftermath of something that had moved through fast and left debris. 2 of Hargrove General's security officers were standing near the main lobby desk with the particular stiffness of people who had been through more than their training covered. 3 of Weston's response team they'd arrived in the last 8 minutes. Federal tactical, the kind who moved with the economy of people who didn't carry anything extra, were positioned around 6 men, now seated on the lobby floor with their hands secured behind them. The contractors. All 6 of them, which meant the full count was confirmed, and the building was clear. Weston was near the east elevator bank, crouched beside one of the secured men, looking at something in his hand. He stood when Nora came through the stairwell door. He held out a laminated identification card in a plastic credential wallet. She took it. She read the company name twice, Corvin Defense Solutions. She looked up at Weston. He had the expression of someone who'd found something under a rock and was still processing the fact that the rock had been there all along. You know that name, he said. It wasn't a question. I know that name, she said. Corvin Defense Solutions was a private military contracting firm that had operated extensively in the same operational theater she'd worked in for 3 years. They moved under several different contract arrangements, some legitimate, some considerably less so, and the name that appeared most frequently in connection with their less legitimate operations was a name she had not said out loud in 3 years either. Brigadier General Harold Merritt, retired now, officially running a security consulting practice out of Arlington, Virginia. The same Harold Merritt who had issued the order in Kandahar that she had refused. The same Harold Merritt whose decision-making had been described in Caldwell's room 20 minutes ago as the subject of a 2-year federal investigation. Federal agent, he'd given her his name in the stairwell, Special Agent Patrick Odom, DOD Inspector General's office, was looking at the credential wallet over her shoulder. Contracts are signed by a holding company, he said. 3 layers of corporate structure between Corvin and the man at the top. But we've been pulling that thread for 8 months. He paused. Finding this here tonight, that's the thread pulling back. Merritt knew Caldwell was coming here, Norris, I said. He knew before we did. That's the part we're still working out. Odom took the credential wallet back. Someone in the coordination chain communicated the transport routing. We're looking at who had access. She thought about that. She thought about the specific window of people who would have known that Admiral Caldwell's transport was being routed to Hargrove General, specifically a decision that, according to Reeves, the Admiral himself had made, and that would have been communicated through secure channels to a limited set of people. A leak in that chain meant someone with clearance, someone inside the system, someone Merritt had managed to keep in place for however long this operation had been running. She handed the credential back without comment and went to find Reeves. He was on the 2nd floor, outside the room where Marcus had staged the 2 contractors from the corridor confrontation. Sacramento PD had arrived in force now, which added noise and bodies and the particular jurisdictional friction that always developed when federal and local law enforcement occupied the same space around the same incident. Nora moved through it with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent 14 months being overlooked, which turned out, in this context, to be genuinely useful. Reeves saw her coming and stepped away from the officer he was talking to. He's stable, she said before Reeves could ask. I need 5 minutes with you. They found a supply alcove off the 2nd floor corridor, which Nora knew existed because she'd restocked it twice in the last month. Corvin Defense Solutions, she said. Something moved through Reeves's expression. Where did you see that name? Contractor IDs. Weston showed me. She watched his face. You already knew. He was quiet for a moment. It was a strong working theory, he said. We didn't have confirmation until tonight, Merritt. We can't confirm. Reeves? She said it the way she'd said Caldwell's name earlier, with enough weight to indicate that she wasn't looking for official language. I've been carrying what happened in Kandahar for 3 years. If Merritt is connected to those men on my floor tonight, I deserve a straight answer. He looked at her for a long moment. It's him, he said. The investigation has him at the center of a procurement fraud network that goes back 6 years, with Corvin as the operational arm. Admiral Caldwell is the senior officer willing to testify about the chain of command decisions that enabled it. Merritt knows that testimony ends him. He paused. He also knows you're the earliest documented evidence of his conduct. Your refusal in Kandahar, the order he gave if your record gets unsealed, and your account becomes part of the federal record, his defense falls apart. She absorbed that with the particular stillness she'd developed for absorbing things that were large. So I was always part of this, she said. Your record being sealed protected him as much as it limited you. Maybe more. He held her gaze. The Admiral has been trying to get ahead of it for 2 years. The testimony is the last piece. She thought about 14 months at Hargrove General. She thought about Slade's policy, the certification requirement, the daily accumulation of small dismissals. She thought about whether any of it would have happened if her record had not been sealed. If she'd walked into this hospital as a decorated combat medic with a classified service record, Slade would not have written that policy. Diane Pryor would not have talked about her near the nursing station. Finch would not have gestured at the side of her head. She had been made invisible by two different systems, one deliberately, one as a consequence, and both of them had their origin point in the same decision by the same man. She felt something settle in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite resolution, but was somewhere in the process of becoming one of them. "Odom wants my testimony," she said. "He mentioned it to me as well. I'll give it." She looked at Reeves directly, "But not tonight." "Tonight I have patience." He nodded. He understood the distinction, and she respected him for understanding it without requiring explanation. She went back to the third floor. The med-surg floor had the rattled, post-emergency quality of a place that had been through something it wasn't designed for. Code Silver had been lifted 20 minutes ago, but the effects lingered, nurses moving with a tightness that wasn't normal. Patient call, lights going off at a higher than usual rate because people who'd been locked in rooms listening to overhead announcements were anxious and needed reassurance. The ordinary rhythms of the floor disrupted and not yet reestablished. Nora checked on her patients in order. Room 414, fever had broken while she was downstairs. Temperature now 99.4. The additional cultures were pending. The patient was sleeping. She documented the temperature change and flagged the culture status for the overnight resident. Room 417. Dressing intact, patient anxious from the Code Silver announcement, wanted to know what had happened. Nora told him there had been a security situation that had been resolved, that he was safe, and that she would check on him again before shift end. He asked if she was the one who handled it. She said several people had handled it together. Room 420, the woman whose family had visited earlier, was awake and sitting up, which was different from this morning in a way that Nora noticed with the particular attention she gave to patient presentation changes. Her affect was clearer. She'd eaten half her dinner, which was the most she'd managed in 4 days. "You look like you've been through something," the woman said. "Long day?" Nora said. "Sit for a minute." Nora looked at her watch. She looked at the woman's face. She sat for 3 minutes, which she could not entirely justify from a workload standpoint, and didn't entirely try to. Robert in 408 was awake and reading a magazine, which he put down when she came in. He looked at her with the alert, observant quality she'd always liked about him, the quality of someone who had spent 9 days in a hospital bed, paying careful attention to everything around him because it was the only thing he could control. "The whole floor's been talking," he said. "I imagine so. They're saying a nurse handled something downstairs." "Something significant." He looked at her. "Floor nurse." "Third floor. I helped," she said, which was accurate and was also the version she was comfortable with. He looked at her for another moment. "You know what I noticed the first week I was here? You're the only person who comes in this room and looks at me first before you look at the chart. Every other nurse, the first thing they look at is the screen." He gestured at the wall monitor. "You look at the person." She didn't know what to say to that, so she checked his wound, documented the status, and said she'd see him in the morning. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall and let the floor's noise wash over her. The monitors, the PA, the voices, the ordinary ongoing machinery of a place where people came when they were at their most vulnerable and needed someone to look at them first. She had come here to disappear. She had done a reasonable job of it. And the disappearing had put her in a position where she was, for 14 months, exactly the person she'd been trying not to be not invisible in the way she'd intended, but invisible in the way that had been done to her. Pushed off the wall. There was still work to do. Victor Slade found her at 9:47 that evening. She was at the nursing station, finishing her end-of-shift documentation when she became aware of him in the way she'd become aware of obstacles in corridors, the specific disturbance in the peripheral field that told her something had changed. She finished the sentence she was charting before she looked up. Up. He looked different than he had in his office that afternoon. Composed authority was still in the architecture of how he stood, but something underneath it had shifted, and the shift was visible if you knew what to look for. His jacket was slightly off-center. Thick. His eyes had the slightly over-focused quality of a man who had been receiving information for several hours that he hadn't expected and was still working out what it meant. 2 men were with him. She recognized one of them as the hospital administrator, Gary Holt, a man she had interacted with exactly twice in 14 months, both times in the context of the accommodation denial, both times through written communication. The other man she didn't recognize, but the quality of his suit and the way he positioned himself slightly behind. Holt told her he was legal counsel. Diane Pryor was at the far end of the nursing station and had gone very still. Slade looked at Nora. "I need a word," he said. "I'm charting," she said. "It's important." She saved her documentation, logged out of the terminal, and looked at him with the expectation of someone who had very little left to lose in this interaction. Holt stepped forward slightly. He had the look of a man who had spent the last several hours on phone calls he hadn't anticipated making. "Ms. Voss, I want to start by saying that on behalf of Hargrove General, this is about what happened in the trauma room this morning," she said, "and the policy violation that Dr. Slade intends to bring to the Medical Executive Committee. I'd like to address it directly." Holt stopped. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and placed a USB drive on the nursing station counter. She'd retrieved it from her locker during a break. Because she had known this conversation was coming, and because she had not spent 14 months keeping records to be surprised by the moment when they became relevant. That contains documentation of every policy modification made to trauma response protocols at this hospital. Since my transfer here 14 months ago, cross-referenced with the corresponding nursing board standards that those modifications deviate from. It also contains documentation of 12 specific incidents where my clinical recommendations were overridden or my access to patients was blocked, with outcomes charted for each incident. She looked at Slade. In 4 of those incidents, the patient's condition deteriorated within the window following the block. In 2 cases, it deteriorated significantly. The legal counsel had produced a notepad. He was writing. Slade's jaw was working slightly. "The trauma certification policy was written by you," she said. "In the 11 months prior to my arrival here, no equivalent policy existed. Specific language requiring acoustic monitoring assessment does not appear in any California Nursing Board standard, any Joint Commission requirement, or any published clinical protocol from any accredited hospital in this state. I have the comparison documentation on that drive as well." Holt was looking at Slade. Slade was looking at the USB drive. "I'd like to note for this conversation," Nora said, "that I am happy to provide this documentation to the Medical Executive Committee, to the California Department of Public Health, to the Nursing Board's Discrimination Review Office, and to Special Agent Patrick Odom of the DoD Inspector General's Office, who is currently in this building and who has expressed interest in speaking with hospital personnel in connection with this evening's incident." She paused. "That last one is a recent development." The mention of Odom produced a very specific quality of silence. The legal counsel stopped writing and looked up. Holt said carefully, "Doctor Slade, I think we should—" "I know what you think," Slade said, and his voice had a brittle quality that she hadn't heard from him before. He looked at Nora, and in that look, she saw the end of the calculation he'd been running since this morning, the moment when the math stops working and a person has to decide what to do with that information. "This is going to be complicated," he said, and she thought he might be talking to himself as much as to her. "It already is," she said. "It's been complicated for 14 months. I just wasn't in a position to say so directly." She was now. Picked up the USB drive she had copies and held it toward Holt. "I'd suggest the administration review this before any committee proceedings begin. Courtesy." Holt took it. His hand was not entirely steady. Diane Pryor had moved approximately 2 steps further away during the course of this exchange. Nora noticed it without addressing it. There was a sequence to these things, and Diane was further down the sequence. She logged back into the charting terminal. "I have documentation to finish," she said. The next morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of Sacramento morning that comes before the heat establishes itself. Nora had slept for 4 hours in the on-call room after her shift technically ended, because going home had seemed logistically complicated, and because she wanted to be close to the building for the next several hours. She'd checked on Caldwell at midnight pressure, holding at 88, rest of his numbers acceptable. Reeves stas enve, and it still in the chair by the door with the particular wakefulness of someone who didn't fully sleep in operational situations. And then she'd found the on-call room and set an alarm. She was awake before it. She showered in the staff locker room, changed into the spare set of scrubs she kept in her locker, and was at the nursing station by 6:15. Her morning patients needed her. Robert's wound cultures were back. One of them had grown something that required antibiotic adjustment, and she needed to review it with the resident before morning rounds. Room 414's fever had not fully resolved, and the urology consult still hadn't produced a response she found adequate. She worked. Odom found her at 8:30, which she had been expecting. He had a colleague with him, this time a woman named Reyes, who introduced herself as a JAG attorney from Naval Station Coronado, which told Nora that the military and federal civilian investigations were operating in conjunction, which was a detail that mattered for the shape of what came next. They found an empty consultation room on the second floor and sat across from each other at a table that was normally used for family meetings, the kind of difficult conversations that hospitals required specific rooms for. Nora sat on one side, Odom and Reyes on the other. Someone had brought a recording device, and Reyes hit on the table with the specific formality of a legal proceeding. "We'll start with Kandahar," Odom said. She told it cleanly, without embellishment and without the defensive framing she'd carried the story in. For 3 years, just the sequence of events, the order that had been issued, the reason she had refused it, the decision she had made, and the consequences that had followed. She told it the way she'd learned to document clinical events, precisely, without opinion, in the order it had happened, with the relevant context attached to each decision point. Reyes asked questions. They were good questions, the kind that came from someone who had read the existing record carefully and was now checking it against primary source testimony with a specific purpose. Some of them were about merit directly. Some of them were about merit directly. Some of them were about the chain of command above merit, the people who had managed the subsequent investigation of Nora's conduct and signed off on the record's sealing. One question stopped her briefly. "Were you aware," Reyes said, "that the investigation into your conduct following Kandahar was conducted by personnel who reported to General Merritt's command structure?" She had not known that specifically. She had it was something like that, in the way that you suspect the shape of a thing without having seen the thing itself. But she had not known the specific organizational line. She sat with that for a moment. "No," she said. Reyes made a note. Otem said, "The record that was produced by that investigation, the findings, the conduct determination, are going to be reviewed by an independent panel. Given what we now know about the investigation's composition." He looked at her steadily. "That process will take some weeks. But I want you to know that it has already been initiated." She nodded. "Is there anything else you want to add to the record?" Reyes said. Nora thought about it. "Yes," she said. "Whatever comes out of the federal investigation, the findings, the timeline, anything that speaks to why my record was sealed, and when I want that material made available to the California Nursing Board and to Hargrove General's administrative review. Because the federal matter and the employment matter are connected. She looked at both of them. Someone decided that what happened to me in this hospital over 14 months was acceptable, in part, because I had no documented record to defend myself with. I want the board to see how those two things related to each other. Reyes looked at Odom. Odom said, "We can facilitate that disclosure." "Good," Nora said. She went back to her patients. By 11 that morning, the story had moved beyond the building's internal circulation and into something larger. She became aware of it the way she became aware of most things, through observation rather than direct communication. The administrative section of the hospital's ground floor had a particular energy that she passed through on her way to the pharmacy, and she noticed it. More people, phones, the specific kind of purposeful movement that indicated something organizational was in motion. Two men she didn't recognize were in the administration wing with lanyards she'd never seen before. State agency, she thought, from the badge format. Not federal. She picked up her pharmacy order and went back to the third floor. At noon, Holt issued an internal communication through the hospital's staff message system. She read it on the nursing station terminal. It announced that Dr. Victor Slade had been placed on administrative leave pending a review of department policies and practices, effective immediately. It was written in the language that such communications always use, measured, institutional, carefully worded to communicate the minimum amount of information required. But the structure of it was clear enough. Diane Pryor read the same message from a terminal at the other end of the nursing station. Nora watched Diane read it. She watched the quality of attention with which Diane read it, the second read through, slower, the brief pause before she looked up. Their eyes met across the distance of the nursing station. Nora held the eye contact for one moment, without hostility and without triumph. Then she turned back to her own screen. At 2 in the afternoon, Jamie appeared again on the third floor. She didn't look uncertain this time. She looked like someone who had made a decision and had come to execute it. "I'm submitting a statement to the administrative review," she said, "about what I observed in the trauma room yesterday and about the things I've seen in the ER over the last year that I should have said something about earlier." Nora looked at her. "I know it's late," Jamie said. "I know I should have—" "It's not too late," Nora said. "Submit it." Jamie nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I've been a trauma nurse for 3 years. I've worked with some very good physicians." She looked at Nora directly. "Yesterday was the best trauma work I've ever seen in that room. Bar none." Nora said, "Thank you," and meant it without making it larger than it was. After Jamie left, she went to check on Robert. His wound was looking better. She adjusted his antibiotic based on the culture results, called the attending to confirm, and spent 6 minutes with him, talking about what he planned to do when he went home, which he was now projected to do in 4 days. Professionally, he had a garden he wanted to get back to. He described it with the specific pleasure of someone who had been away from something they loved and could see the return coming into view. She told him about the antibiotic change and the reason for it, because he was the kind of patient who wanted to understand what was being done and why, and that was exactly the kind of she liked. She was back at the nursing station at 3:45 when Reeves appeared on the third floor. For the first time, not urgent, not operational, just walking through the door like someone who had a specific destination. He came to the nursing station and stood at the edge of it. "He wants to see you," he said. "When you have a break." "How is he?" "Pressure's better. Headache ease. Gone." He's arguing about the dietary restrictions, which the nursing staff on 2 says means he's recovering. Tell him the dietary restrictions are non-negotiable for 48 hours post-repair. I did. He sent me to get you to tell him. She looked at her patient board. She had 2 hours before shift change. Room 414 needed a final assessment, and the antibiotic documentation was complete. Room 420's family had called to say they were coming back this evening, and the patient knew and was composed about it. "I'll come at 4, she said. He nodded and left. She finished her assessments. She documented everything. She handed off her patients to the evening nurse with the precision she always brought to handoffs, complete specific, with every flag clearly noted and every pending item accounted for. Then she went downstairs to room 412. Caldwell was, in fact, arguing with the nursing assistant about his dinner. When she came in, which was exactly what Reeves had described, and which she found she was not unhappy to see, a man who was well enough to be difficult was a man who was going to survive. He stopped arguing when she came through the door and had the particular expression of someone who had been caught in a minor misbehavior and was choosing to be dignified about it rather than sheepish. She looked at the dietary tray. She looked at the thing he had been arguing against eating. "The sodium restriction is for swelling management," she said. "His repair is 24 hours old, and I'm not adjusting it." The nursing assistant looked at her with relief. Caldwell looked at the tray with resignation. Nora pulled up the room's secondary chair and sat across from him. She had given herself 20 minutes, and she intended to use them. He looked better than yesterday, which was a low bar, but a real one. Color in his face was closer to normal. His eyes were tracking cleanly. He held himself with less effortful care than he'd needed yesterday, which meant the pain from the repair was within manageable range. "Odom talked to you," he said. "This morning? And Reyes?" "Yes." He looked at the window for a moment. "I should have pushed harder on the record 3 years ago. I've said it before, and I'll keep saying it because it's true, and it doesn't get less true by repetition." He looked back at her. "What you went through in this building, that's connected to what I failed to do. I'm not going to ask you to separate those things." She looked at him. "I'm not interested in blame at this point," she said. "I'm interested in what happens next." He seemed to appreciate the directness of that. "Your record unsealing is underway. Jag has the paperwork. Reyes filed it this morning. It'll take a few weeks to fully process, but the effective date will be retroactive." He paused. "All of it. Your decorations, your service designation, your combat medical certifications. It goes back on the record as if the seal never happened." She thought about what that meant practically. She thought about the nursing board. She thought about Slade's policy and the accommodation review that had upheld it, and the paper trail she had built for 14 months that now had something to measure itself against. "The IG's office," she said. "Merit. Federal charges are being prepared. Contractor IDs from last night closed the operational loop. There's now documented evidence connecting Corvon's deployment directly to actions taken to obstruct testimony in an active federal investigation. That's conspiracy to obstruct at minimum. His attorneys will fight it." He shook his head slightly. "They're not going to win." She sat with that for a moment. "There's something else," Caldwell said, and his tone shifted in a way that told her. The next thing was different from the previous things. "Spoken with the command, the position I mentioned yesterday, the senior combat medical advisor role, supporting special operations. It's a formal offer, civilian appointment, which means you keep your nursing credentials and add the advisory classification." He looked at her steadily. "It's yours if you want it. Nobody else is being considered." It was quiet. "You don't have to decide today," he said. "I know," she said. "Or this week. I know that too." He was watching her with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was in the presence of a person making a real decision and not a reflexive one, and who had enough experience to know the difference. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She thought about Robert in 408 and his garden. She thought about the woman in 420 whose daughter was coming tonight. She thought about Jamie's statement and the nursing assistant who had looked relieved when she came through the door. She thought about all of it, and she also thought about Kandahar and about what it had felt like to do work that mattered in the most direct possible way, and about the particular emptiness of spending 14 months being made, to feel that she did not belong in the rooms where that kind of work happened. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I haven't decided yet." He nodded. That was enough. She stood to leave. She was at the door when said her name, not her rank, not Angel, just her name, in the way a person says a name when they mean the whole of the person it belongs to. She turned. "I'm glad you were here yesterday," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "So am I," she said, and meant it in more directions than she was going to explain. She walked into the corridor and was almost at the elevator when her phone buzzed the hospital's internal communication system, which she'd almost never received a message on outside of scheduled notifications. The sender was Gary Holt. The message read, "Ms. Vasas, I would like to meet at your earliest convenience regarding the administrative review currently underway, and specifically regarding new information we have received this afternoon from the California Department of Public Health. Please advise on your availability." She read it twice. California Department of Public Health. Not the nursing board. Not internal HR. The CDPH, which had enforcement authority over hospitals and hospital practices, and which did not typically become involved in employment matters unless someone had filed a complaint that triggered a mandatory regulatory review. She had not filed a complaint with the CDPH. She had not had contact with the CDPH. Stood in the corridor with the phone in her hand and thought about who had. Then she thought about Odom and his statement that morning about facilitating disclosures. And she thought about Reyes, who worked for JAG, but who had also, in the course of their conversation, taken very specific notes about the relationship between the federal investigation and the employment conditions Nora had experienced at Hargrove General. The CDPH did not show up in hospital employment matters unless someone with standing and documentation had put something formally in front of them. Someone had. She thought about what that meant, what an active CDPH investigation into Hargrove General's practices would mean for the administrative review, for Slade's leave status, for the accommodation policies that had been upheld by a committee stacked with his department's physicians, for every decision that had been made at this hospital in the last 14 months that had been made over her documentation and her appeals and her carefully constructed record that everyone had told her, directly and indirectly, did not matter. Mattered now. She typed a reply to Holt, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. My availability. She put the phone in her pocket. She pressed the elevator button. And then, as the doors opened, her phone buzzed again, not Holt this time, not an internal message, but a number she didn't recognize with an Arlington, Virginia area code. And when she read the text message that came with it, her hand went very still around the phone. It said, "I know what you're doing. You should stop while you still can. HM." She stood in the open elevator doorway with the message on her screen, the doors trying to close against her arm, the corridor behind her carrying its ordinary afternoon noise, and the initials at the bottom of that message telling her that Harold Merritt, a man facing federal charges, a man whose contractors had been arrested in this building last night, a man whose career and freedom were currently being systematically dismantled by an investigation she was now a documented part of, had found her personal cell number and used it to tell her to stop. Stood in that elevator doorway for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds of reading the message again, of confirming that the initials were what she thought they were, of absorbing the specific quality of threat embedded in the casual phrasing, not an explicit threat, because Harold Merritt had spent 30 years learning how to communicate danger without leaving fingerprints on it. Should stop while you still can. The words of someone who believed that the power differential between them was still operable. Someone who had not yet recalibrated to account for the last 48 hours. She screenshotted the message. She forwarded it to Odom's number, which Reeves had given her that morning. Typed 3 words in the message, "Received this now." Then she stepped into the elevator and let the doors close. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that with something that was not quite satisfaction, but occupied the same neighborhood. There had been a time earlier in her life, in circumstances she was not going to think about in an elevator, when a message like that would have produced a physiological response she'd have needed to work through. Now it produced something colder and more functional. He had made contact. That contact was now documented. Every documented contact was a thread that federal attorneys could pull. Harold Merritt had just made his situation worse. And he'd done it because he didn't know what kind of person he was dealing with. He still thought she was the floor nurse nobody saw. She put the phone in her pocket and went home for the first time in 36 hours. She slept for 9 hours, which was more than she'd managed in a single stretch in several weeks, and woke to a morning that was already warm and bright in the way that Sacramento mornings sometimes achieve before the day gets complicated. She lay in bed for 3 minutes longer than she needed to, not because she was avoiding anything, but because she had learned, in the last several years, that rest was not a luxury, and that treating it like one was a form of self-destruction that accumulated quietly until it was no longer quiet. Then she got up and prepared for the 8 a.m. meeting. She chose her clothes with the particular care that she brought to situations where the external presentation mattered not for vanity, but for tactical reasons, the way you'd check your equipment before a procedure. Not a uniform, because she was a civilian in a hospital. Plainest, most composed version of what she was. She was at Hargrove General by 7:40. She checked on her patients before she went to Holt's office. Because her patients did not stop being her patients, because she had a meeting, and because Robert's wound culture results from yesterday needed morning verification, and room 414's infection markers needed trending. She did all of it. She handed off 2 items to the overnight nurse for follow-through and flagged them in the system. Then she went downstairs. Holt's conference room had more people in it than she'd expected. She counted them in the 3 seconds between the door opening and her sitting down. Holt at the head of the table, the legal counsel from yesterday, whose name she now knew was Brennan, 2 women she didn't recognize with CDPH identification lanyards, a man from the hospital's HR department named Torres, who she'd interacted with during the accommodation appeal, and Reyes from JAG, who had apparently stayed in Sacramento and was now sitting at the table with a file folder in front of her and the composed attention of someone who had been in this kind of room many times. No Slade, which was expected. No Diane Pryor, which was also expected, but for different reasons. Holt cleared his throat. He had the look of a man who had not slept well, which was reasonable given what his last 48 hours had contained. "Ms. Voss, thank you for coming." She sat. She placed nothing on the table because she had nothing to place. Documentation had been submitted on the USB drive, and everything else that needed BT drive and needed to be in the room was already here in the people who'd brought it. One of the CDPH women's supervisor, Martina Delgado, from her lanyard opened a folder. "We received a referral from the DoD Inspector General's office yesterday afternoon. The referral flagged documented employment practices at this institution that may constitute violations of the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, specifically in relation to disability accommodation requirements and differential policy application." She looked at Nora with the particular, professionally neutral attention of a regulatory official who had seen a lot of files and was assessing this one against the pattern. "We've reviewed the documentation submitted by Ms. Voss, and we have some questions." The questions took 90 minutes. They were thorough questions asked in the methodical sequence of people who were building a record rather than satisfying curiosity. Delgado and her colleague worked through the accommodation denial, the certification policy, the 12 blocked incidents Nora had documented, the outcome data for each. Torres from HR was asked to explain several times, and in several ways, the review process that had upheld Slade's certification policy when Nora had appealed it. His answers became progressively less comfortable as the morning went on, which told Nora something about what he'd known at the time and had chosen not to act on. Reyes sat quietly through most of it and spoke only once to provide a JAG-authenticated copy of Nora's sealed service record, which she placed on the table with the care of something valuable, and once to note, for the record, timeline relationship between the record sealing and the specific periods during which Nora had been unable to defend her professional qualifications through documented military service. Holt said very little. His counsel Brennan said more. But most of what Brennan said was structural clarifications, procedural notes, the careful language of an attorney managing institutional liability in real time. 10:15, Delgado closed her folder. "We'll be issuing a formal finding within 30 days, she said. "Based on what we've reviewed this morning, I can tell you that the certification policy in question will be voided as part of that finding, retroactive to its original implementation date. The accommodation denial will be reviewed under the same finding." She looked at Nora. "That doesn't automatically address what occurred during the period the policy was in effect. That's a separate process. But the finding creates the framework for it." Nora said, "I understand. Is there anything you want to add to the record before we close this session?" She thought about it for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I want it noted that during the 14 months this policy was in effect, I maintained a flawless patient safety record. No adverse events, no complaints, no documented clinical errors. The policy blocked me from trauma cases on the basis of a disability that did not affect my clinical performance. I want that specific gap between what I was blocked from and what my actual record shows documented clearly." Delgado made the note. Torres was looking at the table. Holt was looking at his hands. The meeting ended at 10:32. Odom called her at 11. She was in the stairwell, the same one she'd moved through 2 nights ago, in very different circumstances, because it was the quietest available space in the building. "The message from last night," he said, without preamble. "We've had it analyzed. The number traces to a prepaid device purchased in Virginia 3 days ago, which is consistent with someone trying to create distance. Content, combined with the timing relative to the arrest of the Corvon contractors, is going into the obstruction package. He's not going to stop," she said. "No. People like Merritt don't stop. They escalate or they collapse. And right now, he's trying to escalate." But she heard him shift slightly. His attorneys contacted the IG's office this morning, early, which in my experience means they've seen the evidence we have and they're exploring cooperation arrangements. She absorbed that. He'd testify? Against the broader network, possibly. He's not the top of this thing, he's significantly connected. But there are people above him who have more to lose and more resources to protect it with. His attorneys are smart enough to know that making himself useful is the only card he has left. A pause. It doesn't change the charges against him. It adjusts the sentence negotiations, potentially. But Merritt goes to trial either way. The obstruction evidence from last night is airtight. She thought about the contractors on the lobby floor. She thought about the man she'd hit in the corridor with a laryngoscope handle. She thought about the radio transmission, they're already inside the building, and the specific weight of those 6 words in the air of room 412. "What about the broader investigation?" she said. "The network above him." "Moving," Odom said. "Slowly, because these things move slowly, but moving. Your testimony from yesterday, combined with the Admiral's scheduled deposition, we're looking at a congressional referral within 6 weeks. After that, it becomes very public, very fast." He paused again. "I wanted you to hear that from me directly. When it goes public, your name is going to be in it. Not as a subject, as a witness, as someone whose documented refusal in Kandahar is part of the evidentiary record of how this network operated. Stood in the stairwell with that, her documented refusal. 3 years ago, it had ended her career. Now it was part of the evidence. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, I understand. Thank you for telling me. After she hung up, she sat on the stairwell steps for 2 minutes. Not professionally not because she needed to recover from anything, just because the stairwell was quiet, and quiet was something she had learned to use rather than fill. Then she went back to her patients. The next 3 weeks moved at the pace that institutional processes always move, not the dramatic speed of the 48 hours that had preceded them, but the slower, more grinding pace of paperwork and hearings and formal findings and the specific friction of bureaucratic systems being asked to correct themselves. It was less cinematic than what came before. It was more permanent. The CDPH issued a preliminary finding in 18 days rather than 30, which Delgado told her afterward was unusually fast and reflected the clarity of the documentation. The certification policy was voided. The accommodation denial was overturned. Hargrove General was placed on a corrective action plan that required third-party review of all departmental protocols for the next 2 years. Victor Slade did not return from administrative leave. On the 22nd day, his resignation was announced through an internal communication that used the phrase mutual agreement, in the way that such communications always used that phrase when the actual circumstances were something else entirely. He was not criminally charged. The CDPH finding was a regulatory matter, not a criminal one, but his name was now attached to a formal regulatory record that would follow every future credential application he made, and the 2 physicians who had sat on the review committee that upheld his policy were separately notified that their roles in that review were under examination. Diane Pryor received a formal written warning and mandatory disability awareness training, which was neither a sufficient nor a satisfying outcome in isolation. And Nora knew that. She had not expected sufficient or satisfying from that process. She had expected documented, and documented was what she got. Diane had to sign the warning and the training requirement and have them placed in her personnel file, which meant that the next time she stood near a nursing station and talked about a colleague the way she had talked about Nora, there was a record that said she had been told, formally, that this was not acceptable. It was not justice in the complete sense. It was the partial kind, which was most of what was available. Robert went home on a Wednesday, which she knew because she was there for his discharge. She went through his wound care instructions with him twice, not because she doubted his comprehension, but because wound care was the thing that most commonly went wrong post-discharge, and because she wanted him to go home and stay home. He shook her hand at the door to his room with the particular firmness of someone expressing something they didn't have other words for. "The garden," she said. "The garden," he confirmed, and left. The woman from 420 was discharged 4 days later with a home care plan and a family visit scheduled for her first week out. She hugged Nora at the door, which was not protocol, and which Nora allowed, because some moments did not require protocol. On the 31st day, a formal letter arrived at the nursing station addressed to her, not through the hospital's internal system. A physical letter, navy letterhead, delivered by a uniformed messenger who handed it to her personally and waited while she signed the receipt. She opened it at the nursing station. It was, in the language of military communications, a restoration of record notification. Her service record, effective the date of the letter, was formally unsealed. Her rank designation was restored. Her decorations were re-entered into the official record: 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, a Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V, and a unit citation from an operation in circumstances she knew precisely, and that the letter described in the careful language of classified matter referenced without being disclosed. Her combat medical qualification was restored at the senior specialist level, And at the bottom of the letter, in a section that was not standard boilerplate because she had received enough military communications to know what boilerplate looked like, there was a handwritten line in ink. It read, "You were right. It should have been said years ago. JC." She read the line once. She read it again. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in her scrub's pocket. Because she was at the nursing station and had 2 patients who needed afternoon assessments, and the letter would be there when she had time to sit with it. She did her assessments. She documented everything. She helped the new overnight nurse find the supply room that had been relocated 2 weeks ago during a facilities adjustment because nobody had updated the orientation materials yet, and the overnight nurse had been looking for it for 20 minutes. Then she went to the on-call room, sat on the narrow bed, and read the letter again. She did not cry. She had cried about Kandahar in private in the first year, in the specific way that people cry when they've been carrying something that finally gets too heavy and there's nobody around to perform composure for. She had done that work already. What she felt now was different, not relief exactly, because relief implied that the uncertainty had been unbearable, and it hadn't been. She had lived with the uncertainty and worked with it and built something around it. What she felt now was closer to the sensation of a structural weight being removed. The thing that had been pressing didn't press anymore. She could stand at her full height without compensating for it. She sat with that for a while. Then she called the number Admiral Caldwell had given her before he was discharged. He had left Hargrove General 8 days ago, transferred to a naval medical facility for the remainder of his recovery, moving with the improved stability that came from a week of proper post-operative care. She had visited him twice before his transfer. He had been a reasonable patient on the good days and an unreasonable one on the days when he felt better and thought feeling better meant he could make unilateral decisions about his activity level, which it did not. He answered on the second ring. "I got the letter," she said. "I know," he said. "I signed off on the restoration order this morning." The handwritten line, a brief pause. "Someone told me once that official language doesn't always say the thing that needs to be said." She looked at the letter in her hand. "It says it." He was quiet for a moment. "Have you thought about the position?" She had thought about it. She had been thinking about it in the background of every day. For the last month, not obsessively, not with the urgency of someone desperate for resolution, but with the steady consideration of someone working through a real decision rather than an easy one. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me. I keep my nursing credentials active. If I'm advising on combat medical protocol, I want to stay current in civilian clinical practice. That means I maintain some form of direct patient care relationship, even if it's part-time. That's workable," he said. "I won't be used as a decoration," she said. "If I'm in a room advising, I'm there to be heard, not to sit at the table and be pointed at." Understood. I want the position to include a training component. Combat medical technique for operators, but also something broader training for military medical personnel on working with disabled service members. Not as a symbolic gesture, as actual protocol development. He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she'd pushed past what was available. Then he said, "That's a new program." "Yes, it'll take some building." "Most things worth doing do." Another pause. "Is that a yes?" She looked at the letter one more time. She thought about what yes meant, what it closed and what it opened, what she was choosing and what she was leaving, the shape of the life that came after the decision. "It's a yes," she said. The formal acceptance ceremony was not, as these things sometimes were in the imagination, a grand public occasion. It was a room at a naval facility in Sacramento, functional, government standard, with the kind of lighting that made everyone look slightly more tired than they were. Reeves was there. Reyes was there in her JAG capacity. Odom had come, which she hadn't expected, and which she found she appreciated. Caldwell stood at the front of the room in his uniform, still moving with the careful deliberateness of someone 2 months out from a carotid repair and not yet at full physical capacity. She stood in front of him in the restored uniform that had arrived 3 days ago, her rank, her designations, her decorations in their proper sequence. The uniform fit, which was either luck or the military's long memory for personnel measurements. She chose not to investigate which. Caldwell read the formal language of the appointment. She listened to it with the particular attention of someone who had spent a long time in institutional systems and understood that the formal language mattered not for its poetry, which was limited, but for its permanence. The words went into a record. Records outlasted rooms and ceremonies and the people present in them. When he finished, he looked at her directly. Then he straightened slowly, with the visible effort of a man whose body was still in the process of healing, and brought his hand up in a formal salute. She felt it land differently than the salute in the trauma room had landed. In the trauma room, it had been a shock, something she hadn't been prepared for, something that cracked open the careful ordinary she'd constructed. This one she had prepared for. She had known it was coming. And it still landed hard in the specific way that earned things land differently than unexpected ones. Because you've had time to understand what you're receiving and why. Reeves saluted. Reyes saluted. Odom, a civilian, came to a seated version of attention that was the closest available equivalent. She returned the salute. "Welcome back," Caldwell said. The same words as the room in her imagination, the words she had been carrying for 3 years without knowing she was carrying them. "Thank you, sir," she said. She meant it for more than the appointment. He understood that, or he seemed to, which was close enough. In the weeks that followed, she built things. Training program was harder to build than she'd expected and more satisfying for the difficulty. She spent 3 weeks working with a Navy curriculum specialist named Holland, who had very specific ideas about training structure that conflicted productively with her very specific ideas about clinical realism. And the friction between their approaches produced something better than either of them would have built alone. She wrote protocols. She reviewed existing material and identified the gaps, the places where military medical training assumed an able-bodied practitioner as the default and had not examined that assumption critically enough. She ran a pilot session with 12 operators who had varying degrees of previous medical training and watched them absorb the techniques with the focused attention of people who understood that what they were learning would matter in real circumstances. She also stayed at Hargrove General 2 days a week, working the med-surg floor in a part-time capacity that the new ER director, a physician named Abrams, who had been brought in during the post-Slade restructuring, had approved without the particular bureaucrat friction she'd anticipated. Abrams was not an uncomplicated person. He was occasionally abrupt, had strong opinions about charting standards that didn't entirely align with hers, and had twice made scheduling decisions that conflicted with her advisory commitments without adequate coordination. She addressed both conflicts directly when they occurred. She was in the process of being known differently, not completely, not without friction, but differently. The nurses who had worked alongside her during the incident, something now known that they hadn't known before. Jamie had become someone she talked to with regularity, which was not quite friendship yet, but was headed somewhere in that direction. The overnight charge nurse, a man named Patterson, who had started 3 weeks after the Slade situation resolved, treated her with the matter-of-fact, professional respect that she had come to understand, was the version she actually wanted, not the overcorrected deference that sometimes appeared from people who felt guilty about what had preceded it, but simple collegial regard. She remained imperfect. She was occasionally too blunt in team communications, which she teased and periodically overcorrected for in ways that went too far the other direction. She missed a clinical flag on a post-surgical patient in October that a second nurse caught And she spent 2 uncomfortable days after that, running through the sequence of events, looking for the failure. And finding it, she'd been managing a schedule conflict with the advisory position at the same moment the flag should have registered, and she had split her attention at the wrong time. She documented it honestly in her reflective practice record. She adjusted the scheduling protocol to create a dedicated clinical focus window during floor shifts. She was not a different person than she'd been. She was the same person, differently situated. The Merritt trial was set for the following spring. In the months between the charges being filed and the trial date, 3 additional witnesses came forward from the same operational theater, each with documented evidence of orders that violated the laws of armed conflict. The network that Merritt had been part of extended further than the initial IG referral had indicated, and the congressional referral that Odom had predicted was followed by public hearings that were covered in the kind of detail that institutional corruption cases receive when there are documents and testimony rather than just allegations. She watched some of the hearings from a hotel room in Coronado, where she was delivering the 3rd iteration of the training program. She watched Merritt sit at the table in front of the congressional kitty, still composed, still in possession of the surface architecture of authority, but with the specific quality of a man whose structure had been removed from beneath him and who was maintaining the exterior without the support. His attorneys answered questions that he redirected. Face made the small adjustments that faces make when they are controlling the larger adjustments they'd rather make. She watched for 20 minutes. Then she turned off the television and went to sleep because she had a 600 session the next morning, and her operators needed her to be rested. Merritt was convicted on 11 counts 18 months after the contractors were arrested on the floor of Hargrove General. The sentence was 22 years. His attorney called it excessive. The judge called it proportionate. The people who called it proportionate, whose careers and records he had managed for his own protection, called it. In the conversations she was peripherally aware of through the networks she now moved in again, something they chose not to say publicly, but that she understood from the quality of the silence around it. She was not in the courtroom. She had given her testimony by recorded deposition 6 weeks before the verdict, sitting in a room in Sacramento with Reyes beside her and Odom's team on a secure video connection. And she had told the same story she'd told in the hospital conference room cleanly, precisely, in sequence, without embellishment. The court record showed her name clearly: Senior Combat Medical Advisor, Petty Officer First Class Nora Voss, United States Navy, retired and reinstated. The reinstated part was the one that mattered. She was on the med-surg floor on a Tuesday in November. In November, in the middle of a morning assessment, when her phone showed a message from Reeves. It was a photograph. She recognized it immediately, the context, if not the specific shot. It was from the training session the previous week. 12 operators in a semicircle around a trauma simulation. And in the center of the frame, she was kneeling beside a mannequin, demonstrating a vascular compression technique. Her hands positioned precisely the way she'd learned to position them in a very different kind of room. And while 12 people who spent their working lives operating at the edge of what human beings could withstand were watching her with the complete, conscious attention of people who understood they were learning something that would save lives. Reeves had sent it with a single line. This ran in the operational medical bulletin this morning. She looked at the photograph for a moment. She looked at the people in it. She looked at her own hands in the image, positioned the way they'd been positioned over Caldwell's corroded repair, over Robert's wound care, over the 100 small and unremarkable and necessary interventions she'd performed across 14 months on a floor where people had talked about her near the nursing station. She put the phone back in her pocket. She finished her assessment. She documented the findings, flagged a medication timing issue that needed the attending's attention, and helped a new nursing student find the correct approach to a dressing change she'd been uncertain about. She walked her through it twice, not with impatience, but with the specific care of someone who understood that competence was built in these moments, the ordinary, unglamorous, repetitive ones, and that the people who built it carefully were the ones who could be counted on when the moments stopped being ordinary. The nursing student thanked her. She said it was the clearest explanation she'd received. Nora said, "You'll do it better each time," and meant it practically. At the end of her shift, she changed in the locker room and sat for a moment on the bench with her hands in her lap. She was tired in the way she usually at the end of a floor shift, a functional tired, the tiredness of work done rather than energy depleted by fighting the building she was in. It was a different quality than the tiredness she'd carried through 14 months of being at war with the place she was supposed to work in. The kind had been heavier. It had required more of her to carry it and left less of her for everything else. She didn't miss it. She thought about the people who had looked through her for 14 months and the people who had looked at her afterward. And she thought about the difference between those two experiences and what it said, not about her, but about the systems that had produced them. Systems that decided without examining the decision that someone who compensated differently for a missing sense was compensating inadequately. That silence meant absence. That accommodation was a burden rather than a recognition of value that the existing framework was failing to see. She had known who she was throughout. She had never stopped knowing. And that knowledge had not protected her from what those systems did, because individual knowledge of one's own worth does not override institutional power. That was a comfortable lie that people told. That quiet confidence was its own protection that the right person would eventually see. Sometimes the right person didn't see. Sometimes the right person was standing in your corner, watching it happen and calculating whether the moment to act had arrived yet. What had protected her in the end was the documentation. The dates and the specifics and the clinical outcomes and the comparisons to published standards. The insistence on precision in the record, even when the record wasn't being read. The refusal to let what was happening be only her word, her account, her unsupported version of events. She had built the case before she knew she would need to make it, because she had learned in a much earlier part of her life that the world did not always record things the way they actually happened, and someone needed to. That was not a comfortable lesson, and it was not an inspiring one. It was a practical one, and practical was what had actually worked. She stood, shouldered her bag, and walked out into the Sacramento afternoon. The light was the late autumn kind, low and long and slightly gold, the kind that makes ordinary things look more considered than they usually do. She walked to her car with the unhurried gait of someone who was not rushing toward anything, but was not stopped either. Someone in motion toward the next thing and the next, carrying the past in the way that it was useful to carry it as information, as evidence, as the record of having been here and done this and survived it and built something from what remained. She had been the nurse nobody saw. She had seen herself clearly the entire time. That, it turned out, had been enough to begin with. And everything that followed the salute, the letter, the restored record, the photograph in the operational bulletin, the 12 operators learning her techniques in a circle had not changed who she was. It had changed what the world could see. The world had needed catching up. She had given it time. Now she was done waiting for it, and she was moving, and the distance between where she had been and where she was going was the length of everything she had refused to stop being, when everyone around her insisted she was less. She had never been less. She had always been exactly this.